Welcome to the Strome Entrepreneurial Center. My name is Cindy. I'm a student ambassador here at the Strome Entrepreneurial Center. Our speaker today is Robert Pidduck, an assistant professor of entrepreneurship at Old Dominion University. He's going to host the Lunch and Learn today, and he's going to give us information about entrepreneurship. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I have a microphone here, so I won't be needing that. And also, thank you for introducing me. You sort of, I was going to do a little bio bit at the beginning there, but thank you. It's nice to be here. As you said, I'm an assistant professor in across the hallway there, across the way in the Strome College of Business. And mostly I focus on cross-cultural management and entrepreneurship topics. So it's a pleasure to be here today. And when Sharon mentioned this a few weeks ago, I was really excited because it's an opportunity to talk to people in person. So I'm sure you've been doing many of these types of things online. I know I have. So it's a real pleasure to be interacting with people today. The presentation will be about 25 to 30 minutes. And I'm going to share with you some sort of core frameworks that I use in some of my teaching and how they inform some practical issues that hopefully are relevant to a pretty diverse audience, and not just business folks, but people across various professions. Then I'm going to share with you some research, or what I think are some cool insights from research, not just my own, but I will be plugging some of that, but some of my colleagues' research in this area as well. And then at the end, I'm going to at least try to do an activity where I get you to fill out this cultural intelligence instrument. Yeah, we'll see how that goes. And then hopefully plenty of time at the end for Q&A. So what I wanted to start with is a bit of a thought experiment. So stay with me here. This might seem a little bit weird at first. So if I asked you to count to 10 with your hands, to take a profile picture of yourself, if you walk around a college campus like we do a lot, you see a lot of people taking selfies, pretty normal thing, and to give me honest feedback about this probably really weird opening slide for a business school faculty presentation, right? And aside from thinking that's probably a bit weird, some of you might be thinking, well, the answer to these pretty basic things, everyday things, kind of differ, right, depending on where I might ask that. So if I was we're in a room like this in a business center in a big Chinese city like Shanghai or Ningbo, where I was based for several years, we might get a different set of answers. If we're in an Indian city, same thing. If we're in a very mediocre English suburban town, for the office fans among you that slough. My point being, with this opening, I didn't know what the audience would be like today, so I didn't want to pick on people individually, be crickets, but what I wanted you to think about is these three things are very sort of mundane, everyday things. We don't even think about this. If we're asked to count to 10, it's not even on our radar. If we're asked to provide feedback, we just give our feedback, right? We don't really think about these things. But what I want to emphasize is there's a cultural underpinning to the very, very simple things that we wouldn't even think are related to culture. And as we're going to talk about for the rest of this presentation today, a lot more substantial sort of meaty things, intellectually meaty things that inform business and our professions, etc. So for the curious folks among you, before I get into the presentation today, just very briefly, so if I ask you to count to 10 with your hand, so you might be thinking, well, I got my little clicker here. No, never mind. I'm used to that in class. You think, well, yeah, most of us, same amount of digits there, probably not that much variance. How much difference could there be? There's actually quite a lot. So cultural anthropologists have done studies and they find actually there's a lot of cultural variance in something as simple as this. So Europeans, I guess that includes Brits like myself, start on their left hand with their thumb. Apparently Americans start with their fingers. I'm sure we have a lot of Americans in the audience today, so you could confirm that one. And Iran on the right-hand side, starting with the small finger. The point being is there's lots of cultural variance in these things. China has a symbolic system. So 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, or 10, at least in Ningbo, where I was based. It's really interesting that there's symbolic ways of counting as well. If you're at a Chinese market and you're trying to haggle, you'll definitely see people start to do these types of things, right? If I asked you to take a profile picture of yourself, experimental studies for the assumptions people make when taking pictures, how they, what they focus on in various images is culturally based and based on deep underlying assumptions, cultural assumptions about the way that we think. This has immediate implications for things like how we design websites, what we perceive to be aesthetically pleasing and persuasive, and what we might think is not. Again, culturally based. And finally, the question I gave you about giving me honest feedback to this weird opening, again, depends on where you're from. On the direct, indirect negative feedback scale, the US is pretty much in the middle. The data shows that Americans, on average, tend to sandwich in negative feedback with positives, right? Oh, you did great, but actually the presentation is really weird, but you did this other great thing too. Thanks, that type of thing. If you're one of my Dutch colleagues in my department, which sadly neither of them can be here today, they're very, very direct. They're at the extreme end of the direct negative feedback, perfectly acceptable in a public setting to say, if I ask them, what do you think of my opening? Go, that's weird. Why did you do that? Right? And people would be cringing, right, that are at the other end of this spectrum. The big thing I want to start and sort of and get us to think about is culture really is made up of these invisible boundaries that shape our world, right? Why would entrepreneurs care about all this stuff? So far, not really that businessy related. But I want you to, I'm going to give it, very brief background, personal bio to myself and how I sort of connected all these dots and why I study this for a living and teach it, and why I think some of these insights are helpful to entrepreneurs and anyone, frankly, working in an organization. As we were saying at the beginning, if you notice my accent, I'm from the UK, and had a brief stint studying in California, and up until that point, other than sort of the odd package holiday to the Canary Islands, I hadn't, with my parents as a kid, hadn't really traveled, hadn't really been on any substantial cross-cultural trips. So studying in California made me aware of this idea, right, of jumping from one cultural fishbowl into another. And then spent several years in mainland China, mostly around Ningbo, about a couple of hours south of Shanghai. Dabbled in all sorts of various entrepreneurial initiatives there. And the key thing is, during this time, I became fascinated with not just the fact that there are cultural differences, kind of obvious, right? We can descriptively say, sure, China's different from America, America's different from the UK. So not so much that, but the moving in between. That's why the title of this presentation is Intercultural Dynamics. Going out into one different cultural fishbowl and then going back and spotting, I saw something in China that we don't have in the UK, or I saw a way Californians think about something that in my hometown of Banbury, England, they don't think like that. So moving backwards and forwards was sort of the underpinnings of why I study this for a living. So 3 sort of key things today. The first part of the presentation, I'm going to talk about give you some basic tools or a taster for some of the tools we use or I use in my teaching, the courses here at Old Dominion, and mapping out what do I mean by some of these different cultural interactions, and what do I mean by big C and small c culture. Then we're going to move on to some what I think are really cool and recent findings from research, share that with you. Hopefully that stimulates some discussion. And then at the end, as I said, going to give you a practical cultural intelligence tool that we're going to fill out together, and we'll sort of riff for a little bit and compare scores on these different dimensions, and then yeah, we'll end there. So hopefully you find this relevant. If you're a student, if you're you live locally and you're just dropping in here and you generally interested in culture, or you're an entrepreneur, hopefully these things are practical and interesting for you. So the first part, us academics, we like, before you debate things, right, we like to define it. Bit of a clunky, long-winded definition. I'm not going to read this out, but basically, a general kind of definition that most people agree with, the Hofstede definition, that basically culture's made up of these shared assumptions about values and the things that we believe in, and this forms a sort of a structure, right, that moves between generations, right, and transmits these norms, these invisible boundaries to the next generation. So I like to sort of, when I talk about the elements within this, split it up. I try and talk my students through this most weeks. There's big C or small c culture. That can be things like cuisine, art, behavioral cues, the way people move and that type of stuff, facial expressions, art, aesthetics, that type of thing. And big C culture, which is really getting at sort of guiding structures, right, which separate one culture from another. And this is sort of more relevant nationally. There's big distinctions, right? I had a picture of China there, the governance structures there versus the US. Not only are there lots of small c cultural differences between the US and China, but some pretty big C cultural differences as well. So how do we measure this? So there's several dozens, in fact, of cultural frameworks. Some students may have studied these things multiple times, but one of the sort of most famous ones and most widely used ones is the Hofstede framework. And it's really based on these originally 4 dimensions, and then they added 2 more a few years later. And it's based on really mapping out and getting data for different cultures each year along these dimensions, and really just sort of giving us some numbers to sort of map out, when we say the US is different from China, practically how, along what dimensions, and to what extent. So for those of you that are interested, we're not going to click on this tool now, but this link here, I use this with my students each semester. It's a really handy tool made by the Hofstede team, where you can type in whichever country, the home country, the US, whatever, and you can map out a host market country. Maybe you're looking to do business there, or looking to travel or learn more about it, and you can map out and clearly see the dimensional differences. It's a really neat tool for those of you that are interested. I'm sure we'll circulate a copy of this after the presentation. Now, more recently, and so, some of these frameworks that you may not be as familiar with, that are slightly newer, are, rather than values-based frameworks, these are what we call norms-based frameworks. So a popular one here is the cultural tightness-looseness scale. And this is really about, on the one end, tight cultures have strong and numerous social norms, and there's very strict enforcement of these, right? If someone from that culture deviates from some of these norms, there's strict punishments. Might be legally, could be manifest in the legal system. Oftentimes it's mostly social exclusion. If you do something that's a bit weird, you're shunned, right, socially. Singapore is a good example of that. You can see in the Gelfand figures here, Singapore is pretty culturally tight. And then on the other hand, loose cultures have weak or weaker social norms and are much more permissive and sometimes encouraging of people deviating and experimenting with norms. The US, unsurprisingly, much looser culture. Now, this is really interesting because unlike these Hofstede values frameworks, which are surprisingly enduring, right? They last for many years, don't change much. Cultural tightness-looseness is a bit more dynamic, and it changes based on events that countries go through. We can temporarily become tighter and more restricted. COVID's a good example of that. A lot of countries became culturally tighter temporarily and then sort of loosen up back to the base rate when a natural disaster or some shock subsides. But the key thing I'm interested in with this, and I'll explain some of my research on this later, is it's really predictive. We can make some really cool predictions about what we expect entrepreneurs to do in certain settings based on this. And this, you may recognize this image of the famous Asch experiments, the social conformity ones, right? If you've ever taken a psychology class, you may know this, where they have someone, confederates basically disagree with the person that's in the experiment, and they say clearly the line is not the same, and they basically try and test whether they'll conform to the group, right? So they replicated this study along tightness-looseness lines. Unsurprisingly, tighter cultures, people tend to not want to be the one to sort of go, well, actually, that line's clearly, I'm right, you're all wrong. Looser cultures are much more willing to go, well, I don't care. I don't care what you guys say. I'm clearly right, and I'm confident about this. And they're more willing to sort of step out and sort of challenge the status quo of the group. So I wanted to just sort of, really not go into too much depth with this in this presentation. I just wanted to give you a flavor. So you'll see that, or for students of this, or students that plan on taking classes in this area with me or whoever, you'll notice there's a lot of similarities on all these various dimensions. There's a lot of overlap with different frameworks. So what's really useful is when we hone in on a couple of dimensions that may be unique to one particular framework, that can really help us, inform a particular business situation that we're in. It could be a sales pitch, could be negotiating a contract, something like that. So for this one here, this is just a comparison to visually map out the difference between Israel and Russia. But what I really want you to focus on is the communication scale and the evaluation scale. Really helpful when we map these together, especially. So to give you an example, so the communication scale is on the spectrum of low context to high context. The direct negative feedback scale, which I briefly showed you at the beginning, is based on direct negative feedback on the one end, indirect at the other. Now, it's really interesting with low context, high context communication. You'll see the US is at the extreme end of the spectrum on this. More multicultural societies tend to be more low context communicators. Why? Because if you've got people from different backgrounds all in one place, you have to be literal, much more literal with your communication than in very monocultural societies, Korea, Russia, which can afford to sort of be a bit more implicit in their communication. So you can see here, just sort of picking the US as we're in the US and comparing it with China, you can see here that the distinction is not so much the absolute scores, but the relative differences that's really important for us and practical, right? So if you're, from the US and you're looking to do business in China, mapping out these differences on these two dimensions in particular, which underpin a lot of our pitches and communication and trying to persuade people, right, in various business settings, the differences on this scale can really help us to sort of avoid problems in advance. Going to give you a very, very brief example. One of the rookie errors I made myself multiple times in China. I saw other people do this. It's a very, very textbook example of most Westerners make this mistake. I don't really study these cultural differences in depth. So they go over to China or go to meet someone at a trade show or something and go, oh, I've got this sales contact. This is amazing. I'm going to get a big sale. They seem really positive. They fly over, go for dinner, maybe go to a karaoke bar or whatever. And they're like, wow, these people love me, right? Everything I say, it's great. And they're really positive. And what the reality often is yeah, thank you, but no thank you. And the confusion really is on the Western end, or at least for me and when I had this a lot, was how disrespectful, right? Just tell me if you're not interested. Why do you keep giving me the smiles and the thumbs up? Just tell me if you're not interested and we'll move on, save my time, right? But the Chinese perspective in this regard is actually they are being respectful and they don't want the person pitching the product that they're not interested in to lose face. this concept of mianzi, male mianzi, lose face, be embarrassed in public. It's a big deal in China, right? We don't really care about that as much here. Certainly my Dutch colleagues don't, at the extreme end of the direct negative feedback. Quite happy to go, no thanks, not interested in your product. I respect your time, goodbye. Not in China. So you can easily see, right, how some of these frameworks and these differences, lead us to misunderstand and confuse these situations, and we can avoid these in advance by studying them. The first part, like I said, I just wanted to show you some of the tools that I teach that are helpful in that regard. But now I want to share with you some insights from research. I spend probably, 70–80% of my time as a research faculty trying to get cool, interesting papers published in these areas. So I wanted to share a couple of examples with you and some insights as well from some of my colleagues around the country. In particular, I wanted to focus your attention on what I consider to be three really key factors in this area of intercultural dynamics and entrepreneurship. Number one, the common sort of traditional assumption about foreignness, difference, is it's a liability. In many respects, that's true. It is, right? It's a cost incurred of doing business in a different place where you don't know the laws, you need to hire a lawyer, translator, and et cetera, et cetera. Pretty intuitive. We all get that. We accept that there's some liabilities there. But what recent research is sort of digging into, and what I'm trying to sort of flesh out and establish, is the flip side of this coin, which is actually maybe there are some advantages or some assets to foreignness that we can understand, predict, and leverage as a strategy. So in particular, this idea of cultural arbitrage, which I'll talk about in a minute. The second key theme is really what goes on in the heads of entrepreneurs, right? I mentioned at the beginning, I was fascinated with this, not so much that there are cultural differences, but moving backwards and forwards. What effect does that have? How can we draw from psychology research and sort of apply that to entrepreneurs? And finally, and we'll cover this in our little practical demo at the end, cultural intelligence is a really key concept. We're going to look at some of the research on how can we, first of all, measure this, and secondly, what does the research show helps us to improve our cultural intelligence along different dimensions? So these are the three core areas. So the first thing I talked about is this idea of the liabilities of foreignness, and what about the flip side of this? And in particular, this idea of cultural arbitrage. So first off, what do I mean by arbitrage? What do you normally associate this with as a term? Especially if you're walking around a business school and someone says this term. Generally, we think of exploitation of differentials, generally. And we tend to think of it in terms of financial arbitrage, right? Buying something cheaper, right? And selling it, hopefully, for more expensive somewhere else. We tend to think of that as when we hear the term arbitrage. So for those of you that are sort of interested in the cross-cultural world or international business world, you may be familiar with Tom Friedman's work, The World is Flat. Hugely, lots of arguments either side, but his general point is the more interconnected we get, the more globalized we get, these are simple arbitrage opportunities sort of dissipate, right? Because I can easily, if you try to sell me something and you say you have a contact in China, we can go into Sharon's office and get Alibaba up and probably find another factory, and the information's way more symmetric now than years before, right? But the key thing I think is very exciting is the evidence for that may be true to a certain extent, and whichever studies you look at, people will argue about this, but generally this idea that the more connected we are, simple economic arbitrage opportunities become difficult. But cultural arbitrage is something, it's sort of the forgotten arbitrage, I call it, in that we don't tend to talk about this as much, which is interesting because all the evidence shows that unlike the world is flat hypothesis, cultural differences are going nowhere. China's just as Chinese as it was 30 years ago, 100 years ago. America's just as American. And so these differences are these general differences are enduring. So how can we maybe develop this idea of building a strategy around that? So one study I think is really interesting. They basically looked at this idea of the advantages of foreignness, and particularly this concept of creative institutional deviance. And they looked at Korea, and or any country that has sort of fixed or pretty strict social norms, gender role norms, and they thought, a lot of the American companies, startups were coming in and thinking, hang on a minute, there's lots of really, really smart young women here, super talented, really creative, and they're being sort of left out of the workforce, right? The local companies, similar to us, our competitors, kind of overlooking a lot of this talent. So how can we, and this is cultural. It's not an economic thing. It has implications for that, but this is cultural. So this idea of creative institutional deviance is that by virtue of being an outsider and not held to the same cultural standards, these American companies could kind of counter the social norms, the gender role norms, and say, yeah, we're going to hire really talented women and they're going to be managers in our company. And we're going to economically eventually benefit from that. But Korean counterparts doing the same thing, if you're from a culture and you deviate from norms in your own culture, you sort of run the risk of being sanctioned for that socially, like I was saying earlier. If you're an outsider, there's an element to, they're Americans, they're not locals, they do things differently, right? So this idea of cultural arbitrage is really interesting because I get my students to think about this each semester. How could you maybe come up with business ideas that get at this somehow? So the second area, and this is one of my studies that came out last year, we wanted to sort of get more inside the heads of individual entrepreneurs. And particularly, we wanted to know, well, what is it about experiencing different cultures that has these sort of entrepreneurial effects? And we looked at breadth and depth of cross-cultural experience. So breadth is how many countries you've been to and the frequency that you visited them. And depth is how long you've spent abroad, right? And we wanted to map this on to entrepreneurial intention, pretty widely studied thing that basically is trying to get a number on who's seriously looking to embark on entrepreneurship or start a business. And we wanted to look at what's this sort of mechanism in between. So not only what type of cross-cultural experience, but what mechanism. And we theorized that this idea of entrepreneurial alertness, that we have these schemas in our mind that sort of help us arrange how we perceive information for entrepreneurial opportunities. We wanted to see, is this sort of a missing link, right? Does living abroad help people to sort of fill their schemas, their mental schemas, that help them to connect the dots better, right? And see opportunities. And we found, interestingly, that depth, there were no effects for this, or no significant effects, but we found that breadth, so variance and variety, right, and going to lots of different cultures, specifically led to this intention to start a business through scanning, insert, and association and connection. And we sort of theorized that it was this juxtaposition, going to China for a week, seeing some cool stuff in Shanghai, and go, wow, we don't have that at home. Going to Korea, hanging out in Seoul, going to a karaoke bar, going to India, right? Seeing lots of difference frequently helps people to connect these dots, and this makes them more entrepreneurial. In a study that very recently was accepted for publication, we wanted to dig into some of the weeds of, well, how can we sort of flesh out, well, what other types of, what is it about the cross-cultural experiences? So not just breadth, but what in particular makes people better at recognizing opportunities and makes them more creative. So we sort of extended beyond self-report survey data, and we did these sort of assignments and tasks with 2 samples of people, and we basically had them answer a bunch of questions about their different cross-cultural experiences, and then we had them write down their business ideas, and we had a series of subject matter experts sort of rank them essentially on how strong their business ideas were, and then we gave them sets of creative tasks. And we found that generally this sort of basket, if you like, of cross-cultural experience variables helped them to be better at spotting entrepreneurial opportunities and made them more creative. Pretty neat in that it was beyond just survey data. It wasn't just, are you more creative? We gave them these tasks and we had third parties rate them. You can see here, which I think is particularly interesting about this, and we kind of talked about this, you and I, at the beginning briefly, is although mostly we're looking at international differences, the variables that had the biggest effect were actually socializing with people from different cultural backgrounds. So that could be here, right, today, as, you know, from Kenya, from the UK, from America. That could be just socializing with people from cultural backgrounds at home. Doesn't necessarily mean traveling abroad. So the strategy folks among you might be going, cool, I want to know, give me the numbers. Does this actually impact firm performance? This wasn't my study, but Frederick Goddard and colleagues looked at big listed companies in the States, and they looked at the cross-cultural experiences of the CEOs of these big companies, and they looked at the innovative output of these companies, so innovative performance. And they found, interestingly, breadth, depth, and cultural distance along these dimensions, that the more cross-cultural experience the CEOs had, the more creative, not just they were personally, but the more creative their entire organizations were. But only up to a certain point. You see these curvilinear effects here, that sort of the Goldilocks effect, right? just a bit, the right amount in the middle, sort of has the most effective outcome for performance. Partly the rationale for this could be if you spend too much time traveling around and you just aren't really familiar with your own culture, you sort of become disjointed potentially. One final study I want to share with you, which I think is I would call it in an academic sense, the sexiest sort of finding I think I've come across so far in my own research. And that's building on some of these studies in cross-cultural psychology of the dark side of cross-cultural experience, right? There's lots of studies that say the more people travel to very, very different places, very different cultural norms, that have different rules about the same things, the more morally relativistic the mindset becomes. So, for example, you spend some time studying in Saudi Arabia, what might be a capital punishment offense in one part of the world is barely raises an eyebrow in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, right? And people that travel more, the research shows, tend to be a little bit more relaxed about, well, the rules are sort of, the boundaries are a bit permeable, they're culturally based. And the interesting thing is, they link this to cheating. And in particular, and if you're an international student, don't shoot me, I'll pitchforks back. But they found that the more students traveled abroad, the more likely they were to be willing to excuse cheating in tests and more likely to cheat themselves on tests and go, not a big deal in other places, and kind of rationalize it that way. So we wanted to link it to entrepreneurs, right? Because we always hear about entrepreneurs need to break the status quo and break the boundaries. So we wanted to link this and see if it linked to entrepreneurial rule breaking. So we did an experimental priming study. So here's a screenshot here of the primes that we used. So we randomly assigned participants to these two groups. One had, and they all had some base level of cross-cultural experience, I should say, in advance. And then we assigned them. One group, we got them to reflect on, think of a time you've lived abroad, write about it. And we gave them these pictures, right? What was it like? What did it feel like to live in Ningbo, China, et cetera, et cetera. Got them to really think about that. And then the other group, the control group, just did an everyday exercise. Tell us about what company do you get your hair cut with? Was it clean? Just random everyday stuff, right? That's nothing to do with culture. Then we found, we measured the morally relativistic mindset. Was there a temporary increase based on this prime? And did this subsequently lead to entrepreneurial rule breaking? Now, a question to you guys. What do you think we found? We found that it did lead to a more, at least temporarily in a prime condition, they tended to be a bit more morally relative in their mindset. And this led to them breaking rules, entrepreneurial rules. So this study isn't published yet, by the way, but we're developing it. But it's really interesting because it speaks to this bigger picture here of it's pushback to this, because it's saying, oh, so you're saying entrepreneurs should break rules? And it's like, no, we're not making any value judgments. We're just saying that post hoc, right? We hear about these stories of archetypal famous entrepreneurs that go against the status quo, that build new rules where there weren't any, or break the rules, right? And this leads to groundbreaking innovations. So this study, really, we're just looking at some of these cognitive underpinnings of this, and in this case, how traveling kind of helps to build that. So that's the main researchy part done. What I wanted to do in this part is give you something practical to go away with, and then maybe we can sort of use this to sort of shape most of our Q&A. And I wanted to sort of focus our attention on this construct of cultural intelligence. This is really important if you're a student, if you're an office worker, if whatever it is that you do, an entrepreneur, business person. Generally, the definition is it's a person's capability to adapt effectively to a new cultural context, basically, right? Pretty obvious in that employers are interested in this. They're interested to know who is likely to be more culturally intelligent, and they're interested to know, because we know the research shows that it leads to better performance in various ways. How can we stimulate this in people, right? So CQ, it's called. We know IQ. We know EQ was popular, or it was hugely popular in the 90s, and it occasionally comes back again. But CQ is, I think, the latest in this line of different forms of intelligence. So what I wanted to do, and apologies to the folks at home, but nonetheless, you'll still get the sort of the lay of the land in terms of what these dimensions are, and you can see the scales on the PowerPoint slide when we share it after the presentation, and you can do this afterwards. But I'm just going to sort of split these up, and I want you to pass these on. And this is can give us a bit of a baseline of where we all lie on these dimensions of cultural intelligence. So as you're passing those around, as you're reading them, there are 4 dimensions. There are metacognitive, questions 1 through 5. There's only 20 questions. There's not too many. Cognitive cultural intelligence, motivational cultural intelligence, and behavioral. And the questions you can see, hopefully are pretty, 1 to 5 is metacognitive, 6 to 10, etc., etc. What I want you to do is answer without overthinking it. Just sort of sketch down what you think represents you along this scale from 1 to 5. And then what I want you to do very, very simply is add up your score for each of these 4 dimensions and divide it by the number of items in that scale. So if you answer 2, 2, 2, 2, 2 for the first one, for example, you're going to get 2, right? So that would be your score. You would be relatively low on the metacognitive dimension. Does that make sense? First of all, I think just simply go through each question and just answer the circle which one best reflects you. And then we'll worry about the calculation after. Okay, so for example, for the first section up here, right? It's just 5 questions. So you just at whatever score you got, if you click strongly disagree, that would be a 2, right? If you clicked neither agree nor disagree, that would be a 3. And you just add these up and divide them by the number of items. And then I want you to put down in the box below your average score for that dimension. I think what I'll do while you're finishing that off is just continue and just sort of explain what each of these means while you're finishing this off. So as I said, there's these 4 dimensions, and then there's overall CQ. So you would add up every single score and divide it by the number of items in the survey. So you have your overall score, how culturally intelligent you are overall, and then how culturally intelligent you are metacognitively, cognitively, motivationally, and behaviorally. Okay? I love this because one of my favorite comedy movies, and I always think, I wonder how Borat would score on this test. probably pretty low. So, how culturally intelligent are you? The idea of this is to sort of give you an overall score, or at least eventually before we leave today, we'll have an overall score, and then really tease out what are some of the dimensional strengths and weaknesses that you have. How could this CQ impact your own work as an entrepreneur, or your organization or your employees. So you're probably wondering, what some of them are quite intuitive. I think metacognitive isn't so much, but as you can probably get a vibe from reading those questions, these are constantly people high in metacognitive CQ, constantly adjust and revise personal assumptions and mental maps of other cultures prior to and during intercultural interactions, right? People that are very, very cognizant and aware of, I've got a friend here from Kenya, a friend from America, a friend from, wherever, and they're very kind of cognizant of, readjusting the way they explain things and being aware of this. Cognitive is, I think, the most simple, which is your knowledge about different cultures, basically, right? Motivational, high CQs in this dimension show energy and enthusiasm towards learning about other people's cultures. I would, I'm not a betting man, but if I was to bet, I'm guessing by virtue of you attending today and seeing the title, most people are interested, at least to some degree, in learning about different cultures. And finally, I think this one's really interesting for some of these dyadic encounters, for negotiating and that type of stuff. Behavioral CQs demonstrate capacity to use culturally appropriate terminology, tone, and body language when communicating across cultures. This is really important too, where only on average about 7%, right, of the message in our communication is the actual words, and 38%, 55%, something like that. Numbers vary slightly, but basically the chunk of our message is in our body language and the way we say things, right? So this is why this is important. So with that, you can see what the main instrument is that we use in research to at least get some data on people's levels in these dimensions. And the final thing, I lied, there's a final bit of research to share with you okay, cool, I've got this score, or you'll leave here today with a score in the dimensions, and you go, all right, I've kind of made me aware that I'm really low on metacognitive CQ, but I'm high on behavioral or whatever. What do you do about this? So generally, the research says there are three broad ways. Study, pretty obvious, right? You just study, book learning about different cultures. Cross-cultural training and cross-cultural experience. And surprise, surprise, I've done research on the latter. There's a lot of research on this, and the empirical findings are pretty mixed. But generally, the general pattern is this tends to be the most impactful and enduring way of increasing cultural intelligence. Is not necessarily by reading about a culture or taking a class, although take my class because it's fascinating. Okay. But it's about traveling to another culture for yourself and interacting. And we found that really it's about these tensions and these differences and leaning into that, right? And learning how to be comfortable in interacting with these tensions and the cultural juxtapositions, picking something that they do in China that we don't do in America, and playing around with things and thinking about how we can mix things around. It's this underpinning cross-cultural experience that seems to be driving the effect. And we found, similar to the other studies, that it's more breadth, so going to lots of different countries, and cultural distance. Going from the US to Canada, for example, there isn't as much opportunity there for cultural tension and juxtaposition as if you were to go to Japan, for example. So to wrap up, hopefully you've enjoyed today. I'll hang around, for his next half an hour or so, and if you're interested in the scale, and we can talk about that and help you calculate that. But basically, the three things we talked about were some of the main frameworks we use to teach about the nitty-gritty of culture, big C cultural elements, small c. I shared with you some core insights from research about concepts such as cultural arbitrage and the advantages of foreignness. And then lastly, I've hopefully given you something. I didn't know the exact demographics of the audience and which fields people worked in, but I wanted to give you something that's generally quite useful, I think, irrespective of where you work. Some final food for thought is two themes I think are really interesting that we, of note. The rise of digital nomads, right? I talk to my students about this a lot. This was a growing trend before COVID hit, temporary halt. But now, because lots of employers are more open to people working remotely, lots of people tend to be on the younger side, but lots of people are combining working remotely with travel and getting these cultural experiences, and often in very entrepreneurial ways. So we're doing some research on this. I think it's practically very interesting for students here at ODU. And finally, cultural tightness-looseness and public health. So countries' reactions to how they handled the pandemic can be analyzed along cultural tightness-looseness lines. It's fascinating, I think, right? This might give us some insight into, how lax certain rules might be for how long into the future, and how the cultural tightness-looseness may help us to predict sort of the lay of the land in terms of work and travel regulations for some countries. Thank you very much. I hope you've found this interesting. Thank you.
So I have a couple of questions.
Yeah.
One being about your study, where was that most the last study you talked about?
The cultural intelligence one?
Yes, I believe so. Is that mainly people that are coming to America that you're finding those results?
Yes, thank you for your question. It's an interesting one. So that particular study, we're looking at, they're all people in America.
Okay.
Also, one of the samples is all people in America, and one of the samples, if I recall, is people in China. Uh-huh. So we're looking at their cross-cultural experiences in aggregate. Okay. So we get them to fill out a basket of questions. Gotcha. Have you studied abroad? Have you lived abroad? How long? That type of stuff. And then we're mapping it onto the dimensions of cultural intelligence. I didn't go into too much detail there, as I wanted to give you the gist of it. But we were looking at really identity issues as the okay. intervening mechanism.
Because my curiosity is, when you talked about like kind of the looseness of the structure of America, if that has anything to do with that possibility.
So really interesting point. In that particular study, we didn't look at cultural tightness-looseness, but in an ongoing one at the moment, we've got a sample of entrepreneurs in Nicaragua. I always mispronounce that. And generally, compared to the US, a tighter culture. And what we looked at is the founders of these Nicaraguan companies. We looked at their cross-cultural experience, and then we looked at the venture performance. Uh-huh. So we had firm-level data. And then we theorized that cultural tightness, so women in particular, so they in a tighter culture, women are even more exposed to this tightness. And if a business was a family business, so they've got these tight family expectations, we looked at moderating effects, and we theorized using tightness-looseness that the tighter the culture, mm-hmm. the more they're likely to leverage this cross-cultural experience to improve their firms. Right. And the rationale was because they get more of a shock, right? Mm-hmm. If you're in a loose culture and you're like, yeah, everything goes, I do what I want anyway and whatever, and you're not as cognizant, it has a lesser effect. If you're in a very strict home environment and then you go and travel abroad, we theorized that's probably why it has a greater effect, because it gives more contrast. Okay. Thank you for your question. Yeah. Anybody else? Are you do you work here? Are you a researcher?
I'm a grad assistant here at this.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Which field?
Humanities and art.
Ah, okay.
Does anybody else have a question? Because I have another one.
I feel like we're going to talk for a while afterwards anyway.
So when you talked about the cross-cultural training versus cross-cultural experience, do you have an opinion on which of those is better? I know that you said like combining it is obviously best, but if you have somebody that's taken, say, 3 years of Spanish versus somebody who lived in Spain as a child and grew up there, do you think? Yeah,
good question again. Really, from what we've seen and sort of reviewing the empirical literature on that, they're both effective. They both seem to improve, enhance, or positively correlated with higher CQ, but the cross-cultural experience tends to produce stronger effects. And we theorize again that if you're living, right, and traveling abroad, you might not be in a formal training environment where you've got an instructor that's like I did at the beginning, where I mapped out all these dimensions and we studied it and thought about it. So you might not have that, but because you're walking around the street in Ningbo, China or wherever, and that this is more of a substantial experience that sort of impacts people cognitively. Whereas if you're just studying something or getting some training, sure, you've got these inputs, right, to the cognitive CQ, and that works, but it might not necessarily improve any, like the motivational, behavioral, or any of these other areas, because it's pretty clinical, right? You go to a training seminar, then you leave. It might not impact you in a deep way, but living, studying, traveling abroad does, or can do. Oh, great questions. I love this, by the way. I do so many Zoom things. It's so nice to have people to interact with. Yeah.
It's actually for the Zoom call. So
oh, yeah.
I feel like part of what happens when you go to another culture is, like, I think of all your neurons firing in a new way, right? You don't necessarily see the limitations, but you can be excited, right? You see something new, you go, oh, I could do that back home. We don't use that grain or fiber. Yeah. I've never seen that before. That's great. And that would be slightly different. So that's one way that the broad but shallow experience, like non-in-depth experience, might be beneficial. Which is, so I was trying to relate it to the rule breaking. Yes. Is it just that sort of that blast of stimulation that gives you hope and excitement, and that's a piece of entrepreneurship that, man, that can break any barrier because you're excited and motivated, and as opposed to something that you learned, right?
I get what you're saying.
So there's like, if you had two categories, one would be the excitement, which makes you more fearless, as opposed to, wow, this culture does it this way. From an engineering perspective, that's better. We should build it that way, right? Which is
I get what you're saying. Yeah. That's a really great question. And like that particular study, which is not published, but hopefully it will be at some point in the future, one of the pushbacks that we get, or we have got so far, is this mechanism, right? So the mechanism that we looked at is we try to extend the psychology research, which try to explain the mechanism as moral relativism. And a lot of people balk at that idea, right? Particularly, if you come from a particular religious perspective, it's like, I don't like that. And so it may be a little bit of a distraction, because we're not saying people become more morally relative. It's just, at least temporarily in the primes, thinking about the boundaries of these rules and the place-bound nature of them. Like I said, Saudi Arabia, something could be a punishable offense by death. And in the West, it barely raises an eyebrow. So it's more that temporarily it triggers this, maybe things aren't as fixed. And we link that with entrepreneurial rule breaking. But you're totally right. I think that's kind of what you're getting at, right? It might not be the moral thing, but it could just be that this sort of stimulation of being exposed to newness, maybe. Yeah. But yeah, thank you. That's a great point. Are you an academic too? I
am.
Okay. Yeah. Which field?
Biology.
Okay. Oh, nice. Interesting. You mentioned neurons. So we had a neuroscientist visit when I was in my doctoral program, and got to go to breakfast with him. And my first question was, have you done any research, what's the cross-cultural psychology neuroscience? And he was like, yeah, that's a future area. I was like, oh, okay. Well, not my field, but I guess it's a ripe area for people to study, is the neurological differences across cultures. But